Hey everybody, I just want to show off what I've been working on for the Hack Day this year. So my original goal was kind of to work on a little bit of Yard Chef, and my real goal here is that I'm incredibly tired of writing readmes, and I can just pull up an example of something that happens to us all the time. We have a cookbook like Chef Client. It has a readme, and when we look at this README, we realize that like pretty much everything in here we can just determine using Chef itself. So writing these READMEs is absolutely redundant. Like what platforms we support is in the metadata. The Chef version we support is in the metadata. This is the description. We can make the badges out of the source URL. We know all the cookbooks that we depend on. And we know all the attributes. If we properly commented some things, we could fill in the descriptions of the attributes. And when we go in, not necessarily in this cookbook, but in a lot of them, when we have providers, things like default action or the default values for some of the properties, like those things are very easy for us to determine within Chef. But we still have to write these out, and these are really awful, and we get tons of PRs where it turns out that like an attribute is gone, or we put a typo in it, the default value is wrong, or our description of how to use it has not been updated because someone updated the code and we forgot to update the README. So I really wanted to get away from this entire concept of writing the README, and kind of looked at what was out there, and really like adding Yard comments seemed to make sense. So there is a Yard Chef project, as I found out. It's something that WriteScale wrote, and it hasn't updated for about 2 years now, almost exactly. Now, this is a pretty handy little plugin. It doesn't do exactly what I want because my goal is not to get Yard style documentation. It's really to use the Yard engine to parse through the comments. But it still gives you these nice little outputs, right? Like I still get some information. This is coming off of the Chef Client cookbook itself. It still doesn't know as much about Chef as it should, but like it can pull apart this module and it can find some information on it. That's a start, right? So I started looking at like what it would take to do that, and then I realized that we had actually, and by we I mean myself, had removed some Yard comments from Chef Cookbook. So this one is correct. This has the copyright as a Yard comment, but many of them were not, because I had actually updated all of our copyrights in OptiOps code at one point, and in doing so, I had taken out these critical double colons that you need right here. So if this file was to get parsed, it would not properly parse the copyright out. It would just go down here, and that's not what we want. This doesn't give us the ability to properly build these readmes, and to get Yard to work, we really have to actually have things in Yard format. So that kind of led me into another thing that I've been really interested in doing, and that is Rubocop for Chef. And I want to dive in, and I want to see exactly how Rubocop parses through the Ruby AST, and how it's going to figure out like what's in a cookbook and how we can interact with that and do autocorrects and all that stuff that we couldn't do in Food Critic because it was XML and it had no autocorrect functionality. And this is something that Noah has actually been working on. He has this Rubocop Chef project, totally a work in progress, as he says. He's got these 3 checks, I think, that are in it right now, and some of them we're not going to implement. And I said, hey, what if I just kind of forked this? And I looked at creating a Rubocop plugin that would go through cookbooks and properly set up some of those Yard headers, right? And this is what I ended up with. I ended up with 2 different plugins. The first one is just called Yard Comments, and the other one is Yard Copyright Comments. So this first plugin is looking, and you can see an example of the bad and the good. It's looking for misformatted Yard headers. In our comments, we put these in every file, but a lot of people edit them and mangle them, and they get screwed up over the years. So maybe they're missing the double colon that you need for it to be properly parsed, or maybe their names are just wrong. In a lot of places we use cookbook name, which seemed really silly because we had library and we had attributes, we had definitions, and then we had cookbook name. It should just be cookbook, right? So that one, totally our fault, but that was a little weird. So what if we could just really simply get these to be the correct format? So what this does, and this was really just me getting introduced to kind of how Rubocop works, is it has this investigate callback method here, and that gets called, and that pulls process source, which is something we get from parser, which is what Ruby uses. So they actually expose all of the comments, which makes this really easy, and then we can just iterate over each of those. and we can skip if it's not an inline comment because those won't be headers, and then we can actually kick down to this really ugly regex of all the different possible types that we have, and that will just tell us whether it's an invalid comment or not. So that will bubble up into Rubocop, and then if it's bubbled up and then a person passes -A to do the autocorrects, then this other callback kicks in, and that just runs this corrector. And it basically does a replace, which is a built-in helper that they have. So we can say, like, I want to replace the comment where the error was found, and I want to replace it with the correct comment. And then I just build the correct comment the way I want it to look. So pretty simple stuff. Just some auto correct of those. Basically make sure that they are double coloned. And then it does one little thing where we took the cookbook name and turned it into cookbook, because I don't know why we have that everywhere, but it seemed really weird. So the second one was actually a little harder. I thought this one would be really simple, and I realized that I'm absolutely atrocious with regexes, as in I don't have a clue what I'm doing. So we have lots and lots of copyrights out there. They're in tons of different formats, and they're in tons of different wrong formats. So here's some bad examples, right? Like Ops Code is not a company anymore. Chef Inc. was never a company. This is missing a comma right here. This is like a really weird one that I've seen in a whole bunch of places, and I think a lot of it has to do with like funky find and replaces over the years, where like there's a gap where something wasn't copyrighted. That's not really how copyrights work. This one just doesn't have a year, which seems to be the standard. And this one is a person. It's also missing a year. So, it's a little different. Sometimes it's a company, sometimes it's a person. This one has basically redundant data. Like, it is already copyright. Now it's copyright again. And now just in case you didn't know, we'll throw the little symbol in there. So if we wanted a model to look something like this, right? These are good. They're the current year. They can have numbers that they start with, which makes the regexes a little bit more difficult. Some companies are evil with their naming, and it can be a person or it can be a company. And it has the proper yard format as well. So this one, like I said, was a little bit trickier. Again, we just have this investigate callback that runs. But we have to do significantly more parsing to get these things to work. So we have to go through and we have to grab the company name. And we have to do a little marketing sanitizing. This fixes Ops Code to Chef and Chef Inc. With various different periods or not periods, commas or commas, into Chef Software Inc. And then we have to actually do that check where we see if it's invalid. And then we also check the range on the dates, which is another little tricky one. So we'll start with the range, right? We got to parse out if there's 4 numbers, potentially 6 numbers, 20 numbers. We have to parse out what the oldest date is. And then we have to take the current date and make that the newest date, because we want everything to be copyright up to 2016. If there's no date, then we also have to be copyright 2016. We'll just assume that we're copyright at least this year. And that just returns a simple year or a range. So it has to do some scanning over the text and then sorting and all that. That's pretty simple one, actually. The one that was a lot harder, surprisingly, and again, it's just because these things can be in so many different odd formats, is to figure out how to get the actual holder of the copyright. And this is because there's numbers that are in the way. There's potentially copyright. The copyright symbol can be in there. We have all these optional things that we have to kind of like say, like, oh, if this is there, that's not part of the name. Skip over it. Toss out all these spaces. Toss out all the numbers that are in there. But again, we have to match something like 37 signals, even though they're not a company anymore. But like, there could be a name just like that. So keep that name. So I'm sure this regex could be better if somebody could think of a way to improve it. Like it's pretty gnarly in here. Like it's doing some weird stuff. And then we sanitize the name. Like I said, that's a super simple one. That's just some G subs on it. And if we find that invalid copyright, we do that by actually finding a line that says copyright in it. It looks like a yard copyright. And then we build what we think the correct one should be, and if they don't match, then we're not in the desired state that we want to be in. And then the autocorrect is really just replacing that line that we found, that expression here, and replacing it with a correct comment that we built. Again, the complete yarded comment. So they're pretty simple. Most of this was really just me digging through Rubocop and figuring out how this silly thing works. I added it to a Rubocop YAML here at the moment because it's not part of cookstyle or anything. You just actually have to do a require in your YAML file to make sure you load these extra cops because they kind of get injected in there. Rubocop really doesn't have a plugin model. They do, but they don't. And there's some people that are doing it, but it is totally not documented the way it needs to be. So if I wanted to just bundle exec Rubocop, I believe I have to pass the config to make this work. And I'm going to do this on the ARC cookbook. And I've put a few little things in the ARC cookbook to make this apparent of all the different scenarios we can go through. So here it is. And that's just the detection, right? So we're going to see a whole bunch of different places where it detected bad copyrights. Like here's a nice one from Brian Barry. You know, he's not really around the chef community anymore, so this is 2012. A whole bunch of 2012s in here, some Bloomberg stuff from 2014. This is missing, you know, the proper yard format. This is cookbook name instead of cookbook. So we can clean these all up. Here's an ops code in there. We'll clean that one up as well. So let's do the thing that makes Rubocop so cool. We'll do the autocorrect on it, and then we can pull that file up. So we had 20 offenses that we found. We had 20 autocorrected. I'll pull up source tree real quick. That just makes it easy to look at. And you can see here what it actually did. So I do have a spacing issue. I got to work on my regex there just real quick. But you can see that we took one without a copyright. We tossed the current year into it. We updated some ranges, and we updated ops code to chef. And these are all yardified. And then across these other files, you know, we have basically the same thing. Some copyrights are extended out to current, and then things are put in the proper yard format. And it's all magic, right? Like that's all super simple, and now we never have to do this again. I know we've gone through some of these files and updated these things over time, and this just makes it easy to just blast it and be done. I wouldn't ever make this really probably a current, like an actual cop, because the day the year rolls over to 2017, this is going to try to update those cops to 2017, and that would fail all the builds. So that would kind of suck. Like I said, mostly this was just me learning how basically this giant glorified find and replace system works. And it has a lot more cool things it can do. These are actually the really simple ones where the data is coming in from parser directly. But the callback functions, when you start saying like, you know, on send when this is a class, like fire this, and now I can do something that is specific to classes, or this is a method, or you know, whatever. Like there's a lot of really cool callback functionalities in Rubocop that makes it pretty easy to write these things. Maybe easy is a stretch, but makes it a lot simpler to write these than writing food critic rules, where you're just doing like really awful stuff with XML. So that was kind of cool. Next step is going to be actually building out some rules that probably matter. I think we'll start with some metadata stuff, and we're going to have to build some helpers so that we can start having a concept of things that are chefisms, like directives in a metadata. So when you see one of those, it'll fire off the callback, and we'll have to build all those callbacks. But I thought this would be super helpful for people, and hopefully you find it useful.